resources across the state for those who operate, maintain, and administer Minnesota's public use airports. Minnesota's general aviation personnel across the state have had access to targeted information and training to reduce costs and improve the safety, quality, and the overall efficiency of airport operations. AirTap also helps airport staff build a community network for exchanging best practices and learning from one another. So AirTap has 4 major service areas. One is our education and training, like we're doing today, and we also do annual events like a conference. Also, we offer technical assistance, access to experts, and we provide resources and printed materials. For example, we have books, all available on our website. So as I mentioned, this is one of 2 FAA workshops. So last Thursday we had one, and today is about the environmental rules and processes and administration of a grant. Both sessions are being recorded and will be available on our website, which is airtap.umn.edu. So those of you who may be new to Zoom meeting platform, this is just a very simple overview. So at the bottom left-hand corner is mute. So when you want to ask a question during the Q&A sessions parts, just unmute yourself and ask your question. Again, there's the video if you'd like to show yourself, especially if you're asking questions. You can also see everyone who's a participant in this training today. Here's the chat box. I'll be uploading some documents which I sent out yesterday, but I'll upload those for those who didn't have an opportunity to receive those. And this is also, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit them here. We will allow time after the end of each session or each presentation for Q&A. Here's share screen. You shouldn't have to use that, but just so you know it's there. It is being recorded. And if you have any reactions, thumbs up, clapping, don't hesitate to use that. And for today, we have 3 speakers. We have Josh Fitzpatrick. He will be taught, his presentation is on recent legal updates and methods to shorten NEPA reviews in an era of environmental streamlining. Sherry Lars is talking about NEPA special purpose laws and commitment compliance. And we'll be rounding up today's presentations with Lindsay Butler, talking about FAA grants and funds. So again, welcome everyone for today's presentation. So after, as I said, after each presentation, we'll open it up. So please unmute yourself, activate your camera if you'd like. We would like to make this as dynamic and conversational as possible. And again, if you have questions as they're presenting, don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. One of us will be able to answer those. So right now, I will turn it over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, AirTap, and all that make this possible. We were on a regional call yesterday and bragging about how wonderful it is to have this opportunity to partner with MnDOT and with AirTap. It's so easy for us. We really do nothing except for show up and give our presentations. So we really appreciate the opportunity to provide outreach in this time when it's really a challenging time to have training or face-to-face meetings. It's really great to have this opportunity to be able to share information and feel like we're still kind of on some sort of normal path to seeing our aviation partners. So you guys are in for a wonderful treat today with Josh and Sherry. Josh Fitzpatrick is in our Minneapolis office of the Dakota, Minnesota Airports District office, and Sherry is located in North Dakota. I am very biased, but I am happy to say that both of them are elite in their and experts in their field, have been recognized nationally for their work in environmental processing studies, cultural resources, and we are very blessed to have them in our office and part of our team. So Josh, I believe you're going first, and thanks again, Catherine, for everything that you've done to make this possible.
One second here. All right, can you guys see that?
Yeah, it looks great.
Yeah. Okay, just quickly, again, Josh Fitzpatrick, as Lindsay and Catherine noted, EPS or environmental specialist with the Dakota, Minnesota Air Force District Office. Been doing this about 6 some years now. Before that with the Army Corps of Engineers and their 404 permitting world. Just wanted to wish everybody a happy holidays. Kind of an odd year for everybody out there. Variety of reasons, COVID. A lot of updates here in the environmental world as well. Today I'm going to talk about some legal updates out there as it relates to the Clean Water Act and NEPA, and then potential ways to help streamline your environmental reviews, save the sponsor some time and money, while still, looking at all appropriate resources out there. With that, let's get started here. Today, I just want to talk about 4 main topics. Executive Order 13807. People are always kind of asking, hey, what is that again? Can you tell me? Does that apply? And then we'll get into some of those streamlining techniques. Just talk about a specific permit to Minnesota that really helps streamline things, a transportation permit from the Army Corps. And then again, talk about those legal updates. So Executive Order 13807 has a very long title, Establishing Discipline and Accountability in the Environmental Review and Permitting Process for Infrastructure Projects. This executive order was signed by the president in 2017 and really born in response to what you see below in that data. From 2010 to 2017, the average time for an environmental impact statement was about 4.9 years. And the administration set out to cut that by more than half. So this executive order seeks out to do that. We're going to get into a few of the specifics here. And it really applies to major infrastructure projects, and we'll talk about that definition. One federal decision, here's some of the basic tenets. It's one environmental document for your project. It brings in a lot of cooperating agencies and participating agencies to review this environmental document, which coincidentally would be an environmental impact statement, or EIS. It sets that timeline for about 2 years and has subsequent authorizations are required to be issued within 90 days of signing a record of decision. An authorization being, think about a Clean Water Act permit, something along those lines. Sometimes, that might look at a memorandum of understanding with SHPO and maybe some tribes and whatnot. So a lot there. Basically, it really synchronizes the environmental review process for all agencies and forces agencies, if they aren't already, to talk and be planning in a synchronized and concurrent fashion. When does one federal decision apply? Basically, you have to have more than one authorization for your project. So that might look like a Clean Water Act permit. Maybe you've got some endangered species impact out there. And then, of course, you'd need that EIS trigger, and you need a reasonable availability of funds to complete the project. There was an MOU signed by almost all federal agencies in response to this that says, hey, how are we going to implement one federal decision? Well, that MOU lays out these concurrence points, which are not necessarily anything new. The purpose and need, alternatives to be carried forward, and the preferred alternative. And we look at those concurrence points, just as the name implies, seeking concurrence on each of those milestones among cooperating agencies for this EIS document. And then, of course, doing that within the 2-year time frame. Some of these, purpose and need, number 1 up there, you probably, and you should, to honor that 2-year timeline, should be getting that kind of concurrence prior to issuance of your NOI, which is a notice of intent for your EIS. So that NOI it starts that 2-year clock. So if you can get concurrence on that purpose and need prior, all the better for your 2-year clock and that tight timeline. Number 2, there's the potential there to seek that concurrence as well prior to the NOI, and that depends on the project and what's being studied and what can be studied. The third is probably not agreed upon prior to the NOI, that might be a little pre-decisional. But getting that preferred alternative identified in the final environmental impact statement. Us as a lead federal agency, we would request concurrence from the cooperating agencies in each of these milestones. Now, these milestones kind of coincide with particular chapters of an EIS, so keep that in mind. Yeah, and the agency has about 10 days to concur or not concur. Now, one federal decision wasn't necessarily the impetus for the permitting dashboard, but the permitting dashboard is a tracking mechanism for all these infrastructure projects across the country. The dots you see up there are range few and far between: pipelines, airports, highways, again, lots of different projects. So the permitting dashboard, you can easily Google that, and it's a public-facing website that allows anybody to track the environmental review progress of a certain project. The FAA made a decision that we are putting both EAs and EISs on the dashboard. A lot of other agencies are primarily putting EISs, but that was something that was determined internally here. So projects that need to go on the dashboard, again, EAs and EISs. We're consistently getting data calls from headquarters on reporting on those milestones on the dashboard. So that in turn requires a lot of contact with the consultants on certain milestones in the EA or EIS. So it tends to be a little bit bigger effort and a lot of coordination between us as the FAA and your consultant, and sometimes their sponsor. So again, I mentioned the EIS has a pretty hard and fast start date of that issuance of an NOI, notice of intent. There's a little more latitude on the EA side, and the FAA made the decision that says new EAs must be added to the dashboard within 90 days of determination to prepare an EA. For projects, FAA will identify the start date according to the following scenarios. EAs prepared for and managed by the FAA. The project initiation date is the date that working on preparing the draft EA commences. Now, here in the Dakota, Minnesota Airports District Office, we have interpreted that to mean when the solicitation of views letters go out for those EAs. So, when the sponsor and FAA start coordinating with the agencies and tribes, that would be the start date of that EA clock. The EA clock, we'll talk about this more in the presentation, but that EA clock now is 1 year. So keep that in mind, pretty tight timelines there. For EAs prepared by an airport sponsor or applicant, the project initiation is the date when the FAA determines the EA to be complete enough to commence review of the draft document. Now, we haven't seen this in our ADO so much here between the Dakotas and Minnesota, but apparently out in California, sometimes the FAA all of a sudden get an email or in the mail a complete EA document without having ever scoped it with them, funded by, maybe air construction of airplanes kind of company, right? And talking to, the airport. And we don't really consider that appropriate, nor does anybody, but it happens. So when does that EA start date? Well, the FAA has said, well, when we determine it's a good enough document to review. So keep that in mind if that ever comes to the fold here. Hopefully it doesn't, but something to be aware of. Now, I wanted to kind of segue into some environmental review streamlining opportunities for the FAA specifically that we've been implementing here. As the title of the presentation talks about, the quote unquote era of streamlining environmental reviews. That it isn't necessarily anything new, but there's been a lot more of a focus on it in the past 4 or 5 years, and for sometimes good reason. I mean, you see those EIS timelines were quite lengthy and voluminous at times. So here locally, we've been looking at pre-applications and, how can we streamline that? Well, one opportunity is when you send that pre-application in, maybe the project is very benign and stays within the footprints of the original construction. Maybe that looks like a simple crack seal or runway rehabilitation. If you have an exhibit in that pre-application and a basic narrative that you're staying within that original footprint, not grading beyond, we could issue what's called a simple written record, and that would be kind of our own internal CAD-X of that project and saves a lot of time and a lot of money on behalf of the sponsor. As we scope these pre-applications too and review them, sometimes that may not always be the case where a simple written record wouldn't apply, and we would have to review the project under a documented CAD-X or maybe an EA. Hopefully, we're already scoping for EAs well before that. A documented CAD-X would be appropriate for, maybe there's a runway reconstruction project and there's a lot of RSA grading, a lot of drainage out there. And to me, that's beyond the original real project's footprint. So that would look at, we'd look at that at documented CAD-X. Another example might be hangars or something, a hangar area. Short form EA, that second bullet. We've been kind of using this here lately. If you guys go back, say 6 or so years, we had a short form EA. Some people called it a condensed EA. That was kind of a streamlined way of reviewing projects under the merits of an EA. What we've been doing now is our FAA Eastern region has an example or an actual populatable document online. Simple Google search. You can take that and then we'll hybridize it to fit our project. What qualifies for a short form EA? I would say projects that are pretty benign on the landscape. Maybe it's a big hangar area or something. We recently did a solar facility up in Brainerd using that short form moniker. So, things to consider there. If it's a new runway extension or whatnot, I would say a short form EA is not appropriate. Maybe you got new procedures out there, but something to consider in keeping your hip pocket. Third bullet here, economies of scale and schedule planning. Well, in this era of streamlining, using air quotes there, we are having to really work with cooperating agencies on all these processes now and really making them synchronized, whether you're in an EA or EIS. So hopefully you're working with those cooperating agencies. I threw the example up there of NEPA and Clean Water Act. The Corps would be looking to our NEPA document to adopt if they've got an individual permit or letter of permission out there. And so they're already moving through some of their own NEPA phase. And in that NEPA phase, let's say you're submitting a Clean Water Act permit application and it's complete. Well, come draft EIS time, we could combine those meetings for the Clean Water Act permit and the NEPA phase just to save some more time and money for everybody involved. So things to think about there. There's lots of opportunities out there along those lines. Second to the last bullet here, section 163. I think people probably heard that or whispers of that here the past couple of years, but section 163 is section 163 of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018. And that basically says, well, if there were some non-federal funds used to, let's say, purchase some land somewhere as part of the airport. Then, let's say that was 20 years ago, and now you've got a hangar project out there on that piece of land that was purchased without federal funds. Basically that, assume you go through the 163 exemption process here, which we are doing now internally as a district office. If that's, shown to be exempt, then you would be exempt from NEPA review for that project as well. Again, this is all a little bit new. There's some growing pains with it as well, but we're learning and getting more refined in our reviews of those. So again, an opportunity for NEPA exemptions at times. Lastly is this Clean Water Act Transportation General Permit. This is Minnesota specific, but a really useful tool. Us, the FAA, our friends at Fed Highways have really been utilizing this as a great streamlining opportunity, and thankful to the Army Corps. I think they realized it too. Hey, we need something out there to help streamline these permit reviews for transportation projects. I will talk about that permit right here. Issued in 2018, and basically from a transportation perspective of aviation, it applies to expansion, modification, improvement, or minor realignments of runways and transportation projects. We can get hangar projects to apply as well. Now, if you had, let's say, some wetlands on your airport that were identified as a wildlife hazard, and you're getting into that, a couple acres of removal, this transportation general permit would not apply. It has to relate to a transportation project primarily. So keep that in mind. Again, very useful. There's roughly a 3-acre threshold on the permit. So I want to say the real benefit here is the way our regs are written is if there's a 1/2 acre of wetland impact for your project, your let's say a runway project out there, it would be an automatic EA trigger because that coincides with the Corps' review for what would be an individual permit or a letter of permission. However, this transportation general permit again goes up to that 3-acre-ish roughly threshold that says, well, we would still review this under a general permit, not an individual permit. So this could save us on doing an EA, and we might be able to review things under a documented CAT-X. So again, another great opportunity to save a lot of time and a lot of money. Here's some of the categories if you want to read it further. A simple Google search of St. Paul District and then the Transportation General Permit will get you there. I don't want to get into too much of the weeds, but the third bullet there, submitting a pre-construction notification, a PCN, you may not even have to alert the Corps if impacts are low enough. I think the permit talks about a 1/10 of an acre threshold roughly. And of course, you'd alert us. And so if you kind of stay within that threshold, we wouldn't even have to alert the Corps. We would, of course, capture it in our own NEPA document, maybe a documented CAT-X. So again, a useful tool. Last bullet, please scope that out with me. We've used it on a couple projects here and a couple more I know coming up. So really a great time saver for everybody involved and money saver. Now these, I'm calling them additional streamlining opportunities, and these are more global in nature. And this is just, Josh Fitzpatrick throwing some things on a slide. There's a lot more out there if you look at the literature that goes into a lot greater detail and can get kind of complex. But these are pretty basic. So the first one, cost reimbursement opportunities. So sometimes sponsors, when I work for the Corps, there were oftentimes liaisons paid by, let's say, Fed Highways to focus on highway projects. And that's a way to help streamline and keep things moving. Sometimes mining companies did this as well. So maybe, I don't know if we've actually done it here at the FAA, but there's been talk of, potentially paying for a liaison at the FAA from the environmental world. So second bullet, adoption of another agency's NEPA. We'll talk about this in a number of slides, but with the new NEPA overhaul, there's proposal out there to, let's say we have an FAA project, but if you look at some of the Fed Highway regs, you might have some sort of project that might apply to those Fed Highway regs and you could CAT-X it. So another streamlining opportunity out there. Third bullet, incorporating by reference or tiering. Not anything too new there. People do it off and on. For the FAA, it gets a little more difficult, but Fed Highways could maybe do a programmatic EIS, long stretch of highway, and then do subsequent EAs for different projects and just tier to that overall EIS. So, you could probably think of that EA, what I had talked about earlier, as almost like a condensed EA or short form that just tiers to that. Incorporating by reference, looking at another study that was done from a previous EA or EIS, and then incorporating that into your current NEPA document as well. I like this bullet, advocating for funding of staff resources. So that's you guys, the airport sponsors or consultants, saying, hey, FAA is understaffed here. Congressman Joe Schmo or whomever, Jane Schmo, and we think there's a need out there. There's definitely a need for more staff out there. So we feel that's incumbent on the airport to do. Dispute resolution, whether that's formal or informal. Maybe you've got a concurrence point and you guys are stuck, or we are all stuck with battling the EPA on getting concurrent of your purpose and need. There are at times formal and informal dispute resolution opportunities out there. And then there are opportunities to hire a third-party neutral to help mediate those disputes. I mean, groups that come to mind would be the Federal Executive Board's Shared Neutrals Program. That is a free service on behalf of the federal government. The Udall Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution is big on this. They're out of Tucson, so keep that in mind. One that we've been hammering home for years here is ensuring planning is complete prior to NEPA. And now in your planning document with these condensed timelines, you know, it's warranted to get that purpose and need concurrence in planning. You know, looking at those suite of alternatives in planning to save time in your document. The concurrence points I talked about earlier, your purpose and need, your alternatives, your preferred alternative, getting concurrence there, making sure there's no 11th hour disagreements come draft environmental impact statement or draft EA periods. Again, programmatic NEPA documents, like I mentioned, the Fed Highway example. Maybe we've got a programmatic EA out there for an airport that says, okay, we're going to build hangars here, here, and here in the future. This is the overall EA that studies it for, you know, maybe a good, you know, cultural resource surveys don't necessarily expire. Wetlands can, but, you know, looking at that and then tiering to it in the future. Page numbers and time limits, I'll talk about that now in statute. I'll talk about it in a few slides, but yeah, we are limited on page numbers and how long these NEPA documents take. Now, NEPA substitution, this is something, it's been around for a while. However, the FAA, we were talking about using it and then it kind of fell by the wayside. I just sat in on a training by a Interior Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. They're utilizing it a lot. Interior as a whole is. So NEPA substitution looks like it applies to more the Section 106 process that says, well, we aren't going to necessarily seek concurrence from the SHPO on, let's say, no historic properties affected finding, but we're going to go through the NEPA process with, you know, coordinating with the SHPO on the whole project, doing our required cultural reviews, and then put a draft environmental assessment out and then circulate that to the SHPO as well. And we would consider that concurrence, assuming SHPO has no comments. So something to keep in mind there. Again, the agency as a whole hasn't used it yet a lot. Interior has. So for those consultants on the phone doing, you know, projects all over, it might be something to think about. So, but I would guess we'll bring it under our wing here in the future as well. Last bullet, I like these. I've been talking recently on it with a number of projects, but administrative reviews of draft NEPA documents. So before we put the NEPA document on the street, whether that's an EA or EIS for public review, we would be, you know, having the agencies review it and giving hopefully their blessing, maybe not final blessing, but pretty close to final blessing on it before it goes out for public review, just to iron out any kinks that the agencies may see before putting on the street. Hopefully help them save a little time there. So switching gears, legal updates, focusing here on the NEPA amendments that came out this year, as well as a Clean Water Act updates as well. We'll get into both here. NEPA amendments, again, they became effective September 14th, 2020. Applies to all agencies out there for their NEPA processes. And the FAA is actually working internally now to develop some guidance on what that looks like for us. I guess we hear whispers that guidance will come out September of 2021 from an FAA perspective. Now to help supplement that, the DOT has issued their notice of proposed rulemaking for their own NEPA guidance, and that is out on the street. It's supposed to close soon. But in the meantime, we would kind of look at that as our own help, our assistance on doing that. There has been a lot of litigation out there over these NEPA amendments, and people probably heard that. Just tell you here, there have been a total of 4 lawsuits filed challenging the NEPA regulations. There's one filed in Charlottesville, Virginia, led by the Southern Environmental Law Center with a coalition of 16 organizations. Another coalition of 13 groups led by Earth Justice, and the Western Environmental Lawsuit filed suit in San Francisco. Third coalition of 9 organizations led by NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, filed in New York. And then the most recent was a case focusing on environmental justice for the new regs that was filed on August 28th by a group of state attorney generals, including Minnesota's, filed in San Francisco. So let's kind of talk about these. I want these people to be aware because, again, there are legal challenges out there. So there's going to be some sort of hybridized, issuance of these, let's say when it gets to the court. But we'll talk about each here of what these new amended NEPA provisions look like. Number one, the amended regulations eliminate the requirements that contractors preparing environmental impact statements be selected by lead or cooperating agencies. Instead, the amended regulations allow agencies to either direct an applicant or authorize a contractor to prepare an environmental document, which includes EISs. According to the CEQ, in response to comments on the proposed rule, for the purposes of the amended regulations, there is no distinction between an applicant and contractors working for it. So that's a very important point. Thus, for example, instead of being required to select the EIS contractor for an applicant requested action, the FAA now has the option of leaving this selection to the applicant. However, after the selection process, the EIS must be prepared under the supervision of the agency, lead federal agency being the FAA. Another change in the amended regulations is that environmental assessments prepared by applicants and contractors must be prepared under the supervision of the agency as well. Again, that's us. Unfortunately, I guess that was never in writing before. So number two, the amended regulations require contractors or applicants preparing environmental assessments or environmental impact statements to submit a disclosure statement to the lead agency that specifies financial or other interest in the outcome of the action. The requirement for disclosure statements in CEQ's prior regulations applied only to contractors preparing EISs. The statements had to specify that the contractor had no financial or other interest in the outcome of the project. The statement also had to be prepared by the lead agency or cooperating agency. The amended regulations now require both contractors and applicants preparing EISs or EAs to submit disclosure statements identifying any financial or other interest in the outcome of the action. The statements need not be prepared by the lead or cooperating agency, but must be provided to the lead agency. So we'll keep that on the back of our minds here as it goes through legal challenges and what that will look like to stay as listed. Number three up there. This has been a big one and probably the focus of most of the legal challenges. The terms cumulative, indirect, and direct as they relate to effects have been removed from the regulations in favor of a more general definition of effects. Effects are defined as changes to the human environment that are not only reasonable, foreseeable, but also have a reasonably close causal relationship to the proposed action or alternatives. Keep in mind that word causal, that's the real focus here. While the framing of an effects analysis has changed, CEQ stresses that no particular category of effect has been eliminated. Notably, for instance, in the preamble to the amended regulations, CEQ confirms that these changes do not inherently eliminate discussion of climate change impact. Furthermore, CEQ has also focused its definition of effects further by specifying that but for causal relationships is insufficient to make an agency responsible for a particular effect under NEPA. Effects should generally not be considered if they are remote in time, geographically remote, or the product of a lengthy causal chain. Effects do not include those effects that an agency has no ability to prevent due to its limited statutory authority or would occur regardless of the proposed action. In response to comments raising concerns about eliminating the definition of cumulative impact, the amended regulations requires the description of the affected environment in EISs to include reasonably foreseeable environmental trends and planned actions in the area. As explained in the preamble to the amended regulations, trends determined to be a consequence of climate change would be characterized in the baseline analysis of the affected environment rather than as an effect of the action. So a lot to digest there. These are easily found on the internet. So if you want to read more, but yeah, this has been a point of a lot of contention. And lastly, number 4, this section removes requirements of agencies to include reasonable alternatives not within the jurisdiction of the lead agency in EISs and adds requirements to limit considerations to a reasonable number of alternatives. So, we can't shoot for the moon on all these alternatives, and they have to be considered reasonable. There's a few more we got to talk about. Environmental consequences. This section adds a requirement to include, where applicable, economic and technical considerations, including the economic benefits of the proposed action in the discussion of environmental consequences. And number 6, and we had talked about this originally already, but the amended regulatory text allows agencies to adopt another agency's determination that categorical exclusion applies to a particular proposed action if the action covered by the original categorical exclusion determination and the adopting agency's proposed action are substantially the same. This is a separate and distinct provision from the original provision in the amended regulations, which allows for agencies in their NEPA procedures to establish a process that allows the agency to use the categorical exclusion listed under another agency's NEPA procedures after consulting that agency. The amended regulations also require the adopting agency to document the adoption. Number 7, another good one here, which will be utilized. Under the amended regulations, page limits for EAs and EISs that had previously been advisory are now mandatory. These page limits had largely already been recently imposed on the FAA through internal guidance within DOT. Specifically, EISs are restricted to 150 pages with up to 300 pages allowed for EISs of unusual scope and complexity, if approved by the designated senior agency official of the lead agency in writing. Additionally, EAs are restricted to 75 pages. However, the new regulations do not provide for an upper limit of 150 pages for EAs of unusual scope and complexity. These page limits do not include appendices, and the senior agency official has direction to approve of longer documents in writing. So people on the phone, if we're writing EAs, keep in mind that 75 page limit is a hard and fast cut. The amended regulations also include mandatory time limits for EISs and EAs. Specifically, EISs have a presumptive time limit of 2 years from notice of intent to record of decision, unless the senior agency official permits a longer time in writing after considering factors listed in section 1501.10c. Notably, the amended regulations eliminate the need for agencies to consider the controversial nature of the project. This time limit is familiar from Executive Order 13807. However, this time limit now applies to all EISs, not only those subject to one federal decision. For EISs, the new regulations establish a presumptive 1-year time limit for EAs, unless the senior agency official of the lead agency approves a longer time limit in writing. The 1-year time limit is measured from the date of an agency decision to prepare an EA to the publication of the EA or finding of no significant impact. So 1-year timelines there for EAs. Keep that in mind as we scope things. We're getting there. Number 8, although the development of permitting timetables and utilization of the permitting dashboard are not new to the agency, the new regulations broaden the requirements in this area by adopting the following mandate. The lead agency shall develop a schedule setting milestones for all environmental reviews and authorizations required for implementation of the action, in consultation with any applicant and all joint lead, cooperating, and participating agencies as practicable. Number 9, the CEQ regulations pertaining to information that must be included on the cover on EIS now include the following. For environmental impact statements, the estimated total cost to prepare both the draft and final environmental impact statement include the cost of agency full-time equivalent FTE personnel hours, contractor costs, and other direct costs. If practicable, and noted where not practicable, agencies shall include costs incurred by cooperating and participating agencies and applicants and contractors. So that's quite the requirement. And lastly, section 1502.17 of the regs now require draft EISs to include a summary that identifies all alternatives, information, and analyses submitted by state, tribal, and local governments and other public commenters during the scoping process. and the lead agency shall invite comment on this summary. The final EIS must include a summary which includes the same information. Under section 1505.2b, the agency informed by this summary must certify in its ROD that the agency considered all alternatives, information, analyses, and objections submitted by state, tribes, and local governments in the EIS. So a lot to digest. You can certainly read more. Again, there's a litigation hold on issuance of these, but we are using some, certainly the time limits and page limits. So more to come on that. We got a new administration coming in too, so it might look more of hybridized as things get settled in court. Recently, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is the newest regulatory definition of waters of the United States. The rule became effective June 22nd, 2020, and replaced the 2015 rule issued by the Obama administration. EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers have designed a rule that adheres to the late Justice Scalia's plurality opinion in the 2006 Supreme Court case of Rapanos versus the United States. At that time, Rapanos was saying, well, we need to determine is there a significant nexus between these two waters of the United States? You might be looking at some sort of chemical assessment or subsurface connection. But now with the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule, these determinations are no longer required and provided clarity to waters of the United States. The rule emphasizes navigable waters based on its title, and basically divides waters of the U.S. into 4 groups: territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, perennial and intermittent tributaries, certain lakes, ponds, pondments, and wetlands adjacent to jurisdictional waters. Again, you can read this rule online. I'll talk about a few of the definitions here. Pretty much reading them here. Perennial streams, surface water flowing continuously year-round. Intermittent, surface water flowing continuously during certain times of the year and more than indirect response to precipitation. Ephemeral, surface water flowing or pooling only in direct response to precipitation. And lastly, snowpack, layers of snow accumulating over extended periods of time. This definition of territorial seas and traditional navigable waters, really there's no substantive changes out there, so proceed as is. The tributaries definition. Changes to the rule include tributaries that are ephemeral or flow only in response to rainfall events are not considered jurisdictional. Tributaries do not lose their jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature. So, what does a typical year mean? Well, typical year is a key concept in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule for establishing jurisdiction based on surface water flow between a relatively permanent body of water, let's say a perennial or intermittent stream, and the traditional navigable waterway, and between wetlands and other jurisdictional waters. Application of the typical year concept ensures that hydrologic flows and surface water connections necessary to establish jurisdiction are characterized based on normal climatic conditions. Second set of a group of definitions: lakes, ponds, and impoundments of jurisdictional waters. They do not lose its jurisdictional status if it contributes surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year through a channelized non-jurisdictional surface water feature, such as an ephemeral stream. Another definition for you. Adjacent wetlands, these are big. I've got all the ins and outs of the definition there. I'm just going to try to summarize it, but this is now interpreted as wetlands that are meaningfully connected to other jurisdictional waters. For example, directly abutting or having regular surface water communication with jurisdictional waters. There can be a road or other man-made block, but there must be a connection through that interface, a culvert, pump, etc. There are also limited natural blocks such as natural berms, banks, or dunes. Otherwise, it should be connected at least on one side to a water. So you go back to that significant nexus determination. They're wanting to see, well, an actual culvert through the road to connect those two waters of the United States for jurisdiction. So, a very important slide there. Please read up on it. Ditches, everybody's favorite. As it says, a ditch is constructed channel used to convey water. They are not a standalone category of jurisdictional waters. Ditches dug in uplands are not considered waters of the United States. Traditional navigable waters include those subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. So, ditches typically are not. If they're located near a tributary, adjacent wetland, and satisfy flow conditions of the tributary definition, or construct an adjacent wetland and develop wetland characteristics, those are ditches. But you can't have a ditch up on, again, constructed in uplands that develops wetland characteristics. That would not be considered a water of the United States. There's some exclusions and exemptions to what are waters of the United States now. An exclusion eliminates certain waters from the definition of waters of the U.S. They are not jurisdictional. Statutory exemptions are discharges that are exempt from the Clean Water Act permitting. Permits not needed to perform these activities. So, Section 404F, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule does not address activity exemptions under 404F, including those for normal farming, ranching, and silviculture activities as part of an established operation. So, I've heard here and there, people may perform silviculture activities on an airport and sell that timber to some industry or whatever, and that I guess could be considered exempt from Clean Water Act permitting. The Navigable Waters Protection Rule does not address national pollutant discharge elimination systems exclusions. Some elements of these exclusions, again, uplands, any land that area under normal circumstances that does not satisfy hydrology, the vegetation requirements, and soils requirements, and does not lie below the ordinary high water mark or the high tide. And then also features constructed or excavated in uplands, again, are non-jurisdictional waters, must be constructed, excavated wholly in uplands or non-jurisdictional waters to meet these exclusions. Remember, certain excluded features may convey surface water flow to a downstream jurisdictional water in a typical year, thereby serving as a connection for upstream and downstream jurisdictional tributaries, lakes, ponds, and impoundments. This does not include groundwater, diffuse stormwater runoff, overland sheet flow. Excluded features that convey surface water flow between jurisdictional waters in a typical year do not, in and of themselves, become waters of the United States. There's a couple examples of the excluded features of the waters of the United States definition, so keep those in your hip pocket. But again, there's been a lot of litigation out there on the Navigable Waters Protection Rule by environmental groups, cities, states, Minnesota again being one of them. Interestingly, ranchers and cattlemen groups have filed suit under the ephemeral stream designation as well. I guess my little joke down there, waters of the United States been litigated for decades now, and lawyers are making good money off it. And so there'll be a stay. There is a stay on these issuance of this protection rule. So again, with the new administration, as these lawsuits, are finalized in court, we'll probably see some sort of hybrid of this, probably with the 2015 rule. So more to come on that, but good hip pocket resources for the future. So with that, do people have questions?
Does anyone have questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask directly. If not, we'll get Sherry, give her a few minutes to get ready, get set up. Oh, there she goes. Okay. Well, Josh will be around for the rest of the meeting. Plus, you have his contact information if you want to follow up him afterwards.
All righty, so everyone can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound and look good.
All right, I'm gonna go quick as much as I can. I also have a lot of slides, but I come from the East Coast, I tend to talk a lot quicker. So we'll see what I can do here in a short stretch of time. So I'm actually going to dive a little bit deeper into NEPA and get into the special purpose laws and commitment compliance today. So under NEPA, you know, when we do environmental documentation, we have a lot of chapters that we go through, but in the impact section, we're really focusing on the special purpose laws. And today I'll talk about those certain ones, commitments, and also Section 4F evaluations. NEPA is also referred to as the umbrella law because there's a lot of special legislation, regulations that fit under that window or umbrella of NEPA as we discuss impact categories and those special purpose laws that fit each individual impact category. So today I'll talk about the Clean Water Act, Executive Order 11990, Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, and Section 4F. So the Endangered Species Act was enacted in 1973, and it's actually administered by two federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries. Its goal is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. And it's important to conserve candidate species so those species do not get listed under the Act if we're able to do so. Fish and Wildlife focuses on birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, inverts, and freshwater fish, where the National Marine Fisheries obviously focuses on the marine environments, including marine mammals, inverts, and fish. Now, species are often listed as either endangered or threatened, or as a candidate for listing on the endangered species list. Now, I want to call out some specific terminology. Now, we see that in the National Historic Preservation Act as it refers to area of potential effect, but under the Endangered Species Act, we look at action area, action, effects, direct and indirect effects. And so I'd like you to really focus in on that as I talk to both endangered species and historic properties. So the action refers to activities or programs authorized or funded by a federal agency. And the action area includes the areas that may be affected directly or indirectly by the federal action. And effects are either direct or indirect related to the action on a species or critical habitat. Now, there's a number of sections within that act, but you'll find that within the FAA, we really focus in on Section 7. That really seems to be where we consult with Fish and Wildlife mainly, but there's a few occasions where we might work under Section 9 or 10. Section 7 refers to the Section 7 consultation process, where any action that the federal agency authorizes, funds, or carries out refers to that process that we go through. But Section 9 is when there may be a take of a listed species, and take is defined as harm, hunt, shoot, wound, trap, or collect a listed species or candidate species. Now, Section 10 refers to when a permit is permitted under the Act, where it's in a limited take of species under a specific reason, whether it be for scientific purposes or for propagation or survival of the species. As an example, my husband had an actual Section 10 permit to collect marine invertebrates down in the Keys when he was working on his degree. There's also an important note to make that at the time the original list of species were protected when the law was enacted, there's a number of those species have fully recovered and were delisted. The bald eagle is one of them. So Section 7 consultation, there's actually two types of consultation, whether it be informal or formal. In most cases, we handle our consultation with Fish and Wildlife informally because most of our projects result in either a no effect or a may affect not likely to adversely affect. There's a rare occasion, though, that we may have an effect that's likely to adversely affect the species or the habitat upon which they live on. Also important to note is that we do have candidate species and they do not have legal protection, but it is a benefit to us if we consider those effects under Section 7 to candidate species, because oftentimes after we complete NEPA, Section 7, a candidate species may become listed and the project hadn't been constructed yet. Well, we have to go back into NEPA and open up Section 7 and consult on that species that was a candidate that is now listed. So if we currently have a candidate species during NEPA, we'd like to actually work through the effect determination and get it taken care of, because the likelihood of the project getting constructed, say 3 years from NEPA, will likely be listed by that point. Some of the helpful tips we've developed over the years under some of these special purpose laws. For endangered species, we like to use IPAC. That's a Fish and Wildlife website, information for planning and consultation, where you log in and identify your project areas that's labeled as action area, and be sure to include your limits of construction that might have your access road, your staging, your borrow or aggregate locations. Make sure your footprint is large enough, because you want to include all of that as your action area, because you may have direct and indirect effects. That website will then produce, and you're able to print out your official species list. It also gives you a list of wetlands in the area. It'll give you a list of Fish and Wildlife property interests, so you know where the refuges and easement properties are located in relationship to your property. And you use that information in preparing your effect determination. Now in the ADO in the Dakotas, we actually developed a table that I'll show you in a minute in consultation with Fish and Wildlife, so that we have supporting documentation on how we come up with a effect determination. In the years past, I found that a lot of these documented CADXs, I think people blindly covered their eyes and checked the no box and never gave us any detailed information. I didn't know what species were in the county. I didn't know how they determined that there was no effect, because they didn't even list the species. So that wasn't good for our administrative file record. So developing this table, working with Fish and Wildlife, it gives us more information for our administrative file record if we ever get called out on those projects. So this is actually what it looks like when you get your printout from IPAC. For example, in the county that you're working in, maybe there's only the crane, sturgeon, and the tern. And so all the other species are not present. So you'll check that box for the remaining species. And then working with the guidance on that table, that column is essentially a threshold that you can look at in relationship to the project that you're working on. And if it meets within that guidance, then you can make that determination of a no effect. And that will go into the environmental document. So aquatic resources, Josh dove pretty deep into the Clean Water Act, and I'll just highlight a few things. One of the things we really want to focus on is when people do delineations in the field, we submit that to the Corps to get the jurisdictional determination. Thinking separately, there's this other area that we focus in on, and that's the Executive Order 11990, protection of wetlands. And that's really focusing in on the natural wetlands. And I say that because we're looking at wetlands and waters of the US in different, think of it as categories. So we need to know whether or not those wetlands are natural or artificial, and whether or not they are jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional. Because if they are not natural and they are not jurisdictional, we do not need to mitigate that. But if you don't identify that information when you do your field delineation on natural or artificial wetlands, it's very challenging for us to determine whether or not we will be mitigating under that executive order. But it's very clear under the Corps because they determine jurisdiction. Some of the helpful tips, like I said, please identify the limits of construction. Always remember, think of the pieces of equipment, contractor operations, how you're going to access the site. Include that as your footprint so that we identify whether or not we have temporary or permanent impacts. We also want to identify the delineation, include that as an appended by reference in the document. I don't need the delineation in the appendix, just append it by reference. But we do want the jurisdictional determination included in the appendix. If there's any other methods that were used to identify wetlands, speak to that and include that information in the appendix. It's all about building your record. Identify wetland limits on plan view and cross sections. We want to really be able to see how you're determining the temporary and permanent impacts as you're preparing your plans or impacts related to NEPA. And I, again, speak to the 4 different classifications. Here they are: artificial jurisdictional, artificial non-jurisdictional, natural jurisdictional, and natural non-jurisdictional. We mitigate for 3 of those categories. The one we don't is the artificial non-jurisdictional. And always include your measures to avoid, minimize, and how you're mitigating in the environmental document, as well as any related environmental commitments. The National Historic Preservation Act, enacted in 1966, is intended to preserve historic and archaeological sites. It also created the National Register as well as the National Landmarks. The state tribal historic preservation offices in positions of TIPO and SHPO officers, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And it also requires our agency and other federal agencies to identify and assess the effects to historic and archaeological resources. Tribal consultation is a big thing for Josh and I. In the Upper Great Plains, we actively consult with about 19 tribes. 11 of them are very active. Oftentimes we have projects where the tribes have traditional cultural specialists participating in field surveys as well as construction monitoring. And it is the FAA's environmental protection specialist responsibility to consult with the tribes on the project because it is a government to government relationship. And we will also coordinate with the tribes on the available resources for the traditional cultural specialists to conduct the field surveys and construction monitoring. Once we get that all lined up, we'll turn over that information to the consultant for the day-to-day logistics of the field work, whether that be the per diem, the travel, the hotel arrangements, the schedule for field work. But we'll get everything lined up and then turn everything over to you for that day-to-day operations. It's very important for you to know that all maps, drawings, files, and site location data related to traditional cultural properties are to be housed at the FAA due to the sensitive nature of the information. And all avoidance area buffers that are established for project maps and ALP sheets are in consultation with the tribes. It is not to be left in the consultant's office and the municipal government offices with that site location data. All of that is retained at the federal office or with the tribes. Some of the helpful tips that we've developed is identifying whether a file search or class 3 survey was completed and whether the traditional cultural properties survey was also completed. And we'll include that as an append by reference, not as an attachment in the appendix. Identify whether sites were included in the area of potential effect, and note that the APE includes the geographic area in which direct and indirect effects could occur. So again, thinking of the Endangered Species Act, it is the action area, but when you speak to the cultural resources, it's the area of potential effect. And please include any SHPO or TIPO concurrence letters in the appendix. So the U.S. Department of Transportation Act, Section 4F, was enacted in 1966. So this really only applies to U.S. DOT agencies, Federal Highway, Federal Rail, Federal Transit, and the Federal Aviation Administration. That it's our act that we have to comply with. And it pertains to publicly owned park and recreation areas, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, historic properties on or eligible on the register, archaeological sites and TCPs that are eligible or on the register, and historic districts. So there's very specific defining criteria for each of those categories. So for park recreation areas and refuges, it has to be a publicly owned park, recreation area, and refuge. It has to also be open to the public, except in cases of refuges. For example, a school could be considered a recreation area because the playground is for recreation and it's publicly owned often in cases. But if it is limited to access, then it's not considered open to the public. So you have to go through that 4F policy paper and really step through all the defining criteria and questions related to each individual type of resource. It pertains to golf courses and fairgrounds. And so it really gets deep into how you define whether or not it is or not applicable to 4F. And it also speaks to the major purpose of the resource and whether or not it's a significant resource. And that determination is made in coordination with the officials with jurisdiction. And all determinations of significance are made by the federal agency. Wildlife management areas is also a tricky situation because the naming convention is unique and sometimes used loosely. We see terms used such as preserve, sanctuary, waterfowl production areas. We also have wetland easements and grassland easements. So there's a number of things you have to go through the detailed list under the policy paper to determine whether or not 4F applies. And in many cases, there's local, state, or federal laws that did not make a clear distinction between the refuge and management area. So you have to really dig deep, examine the property, the enabling legislation for those resources, review the management plans for those types of properties, and coordinate with the officials with jurisdiction. Historic sites also are a little bit interesting. Sometimes you'll see us say cultural resources, historic sites. Well, think of cultural resources like an umbrella as well, because the law pertains to historic sites because that's based on a time. And cultural resources is the umbrella because we also look at archaeological sites and traditional cultural properties that are later in time or older in time. And so we'll call them cultural resources, but the law refers to historic. But they must be national, state, or local significant. And they must be on or eligible for the register. And note that the first step is to determine whether or not it's eligible on the register before even applying the 4F criteria. And we also have to go through the identification of any contributing and non-contributing elements of a historic district when determining eligibility of 4F and how we prepare that 4F evaluation. For example, we had a historic district on one of our recent projects. Everyone seemed to be just focusing on the one hangar, but there was actually, if you looked up, there were other older hangars similar in type. And so getting an architectural survey done of the remaining buildings on that property. So we ended up having a historic district. The beacon tower was a contributing element of that historic district. And all of that was described in that 4F evaluation. Some of the types of historic properties on airports, including buildings in historic districts. We've had transportation facilities such as radar stations, beacon towers, and even runways. There's also historic trails and ditches that have been deemed historic and also considered 4F. Archaeological sites, it's a little bit more criteria that you have to dig through the policy paper on, as well as traditional cultural properties that are 4F eligible as well. So once you've determined that you have a resource that is applicable to 4F, the next step is determining the use of that resource. And there's 3 types, whether it's a permanent incorporation, temporary occupancy, or constructive use. Some of it's pretty clear, you know, if you're permanently impacting something, you know, we all dealt with that before. Temporary occupancy, though, you have to determine whether or not that use is adverse to the purpose of that resource. If it's not adverse, you know, maybe it's only just a temporary use during construction, maybe the access to that resource is shut down, but it's not adverse. Maybe there's another way into that park or, you know, other 4F property. If it's not adverse, we can go through the de minimis process. The third one is constructive use, and that's a high bar. Proximity impacts that are so great that activities, features, and attributes are substantially impaired. I am not familiar with one at an airport. I've dealt with one on a highway. There was a lot of effort put into that. It was never proven that the proximity impacts would substantially impair the resource. And so it never passed the bar for being considered constructive use. Now, FAA may not approve the use of the 4F resource if there's no feasible or prudent alternative that's an avoidance alternative. And that you have to clearly show that you've gone through all possible planning to minimize harm to that resource. De minimis, this was probably about 15 years ago when they developed I guess you could say a streamlining effort to not have to prepare a 4F evaluation. If you could show that it's a de minimis use, then we just completed that documentation. But there's certain thresholds. If it's a historic property, it has to be a no adverse effect. If it's an adverse effect, we can't use de minimis. The goal here is to not have to write a 4F evaluation. but you also have to have the written concurrence. You have to know whether or not your ACHP is participating or not. If they are participating, you also need their concurrence. And all of this with your 106 findings, section 106, under the National Historic Preservation Act, it's all developed in consultation with all of the different consulting parties. The next one is the park recreation areas and refuges. They require public notice and opportunity for review. And if it's determined that there's no adverse effect to the activities, features, or attributes to the resource, and that the officials with jurisdiction concur, then we have a de minimis use and no further documentation is warranted. Some of the helpful tips getting through 4F. Well, you definitely need to contact your city, county, and state park departments to determine if you even have a park or recreation area in or near your area of potential effect. For refuges, you can look at that IPAC printout that I spoke about with endangered species. That printout will show it will show trying to get ahead of myself. It will show whether or not there's any property interests of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Pertaining to historic properties, you can look at your file search that was prepared when you had your cultural resource survey completed. And you determine whether or not a temporary occupancy will constitute use, or if not, would it result in a permanent use? You have to determine that and put that in your environmental document. All documentation should be included in a chapter in the environmental document that's specific to section 4F and its appendices. And also, you're going to want to contact the State Park and Rec Department to obtain a list of land and water conservation grants that have been issued in the county where the airport is located. It used to be that we were able to go onto a website, but with the current administration, that has been removed. So we're not able to access that information. So you have to go through your State Park and Rec to get that list of conservation grants in the county where your project is. Once you determine if you have a resource that has received those funds in your area, that's considered a 6F resource. It's also considered 4F. And then you're going to need to take additional steps to determine whether or not you will be impacting or using those resources and provide additional documentation, and it requires more coordination and approval processes with that additional property label. So environmental commitments, why do we do this? Well, as we're consulting with agencies, there may be measures that are identified on how to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts during that process. And we then commit to those measures to support a mitigated FONSI so as to complete the review of a potentially significant environmental impact without preparing the EIS. We also commit to mitigation measures to achieve an environmentally preferred outcome. And there may be special permit conditions that may identify some commitments that we have to put into the environmental document or incorporate into the design plans. So this may occur whether we're doing a documented CADX, or EA, or EIS. It comes from the consultation process with the agencies, as well as the permitting process. So how do we do this? So any commitment that comes in, we're going to want to identify that in the document. And we typically show that in a very specialized section of the document because it makes it easier when we communicate to the designer at the end of NEPA, who will pick up and start including those commitments into the design plans. And then in the design plans, we also want to call those commitments out clearly in a section so it stands out for the contractor when he's bidding his project. And there's occasions where we may include them also in a special provision. We always want to make sure to cross-reference commitments to make sure we don't have any contradictions, and create and document a process on how we're tracking and implementing those commitments. If there's ever a case where there might be a modification of commitments, we need to understand why those commitments were initially adopted. If there's any changes that may come about to the project, whether it's a change order or maybe during the design, something resulted into a revision that will impact a commitment that we made, then there's additional coordination that we need to get back to. That's looking back at NEPA. We have to consult with the agencies. Perhaps we even have to modify a permit because of it. We have to look at the plans and contract documents because it could affect many places. Some of the examples that we've used in the past on commitments, for example, culture resources, we have avoidance areas that are not to be disturbed, and we fence them prior to commencement of construction. We include that in the commitments in the document as well as the plans, and it was included in the design and shown on the plans. For biological resources, there's been a few occasions where we're in the migration corridor of the whooping crane, and Fish and Wildlife has requested that we mark the utility line for every length in feet that's moved, installed, or raised. We have to mark the new line at a ratio of 2:1. Another example is if we are removing trees, they're to remove trees outside the maternity and pup season for the northern long-eared bat. We also identify the amount of acres of impacts to wetlands, and we include the 4 categories, and we identify the mitigation that's being used. If we don't commit to those commitments in the document, or if we don't monitor to ensure that those commitments are implemented, it may result in the failure to advance our NEPA's purpose for ensuring that we have an informed and transparent decision-making process. It also undermines the integrity of the NEPA review, and it causes issues with the ability to close out the project, which then could jeopardize federal funding with related compliance issues. I want you to understand that all closeout reports I'm reviewing, and I find a lot of issues with projects. We've found where a project did not build the mitigation site. We've had the action area change and resulted in additional impacts that never were mitigated or permitted. And so we have to go back and reopen the environmental document and work with the consultant who's, 3 years later now trying to close out the report and wanting a new grant for something else. It's not something you want to have to go through. I think it's important that people need to be cognizant of any changes that they're doing and go back and look at what did the original footprint for environmental approval was originally issued under. Don't ignore it and then issue a closeout report and think it's just going to fly by. We're looking at these. Some of the successful implementation practices: negotiate with the agencies on commitments. Ensure it's feasible and prudent. There may be cases where the commitment is not practicable. And so we'll get involved in working with the resource agencies and talk about what might not work and why, and try and develop something that's amenable to the agency that accomplishes their goals as well as ours. Be sure to incorporate those commitments. Subsequent funding, permitting, and other approvals are conditional on that commitment compliance. Communicate commitments to project engineers so that they can incorporate into design, construction, and maintenance. I have been attending pre-construction meetings to communicate commitments so that contractors understand. In particular, tribal consultation is a very unique situation, having people on site monitoring construction. And so I'll bring that conversation up in pre-construction meetings, and more of the contractors are getting used to this process with our projects. Also, track commitments. Be sure to complete those and make sure they're incorporated and documented well in compliance with those commitments. We want to make sure you're compliant so that your next project is going to go smoother. And lastly, going back to NEPA, we have some keys to success. Clear writing and readability. You have to remember that these documents are written at an 8th grade reading level for the general public. It's notorious for FAA NEPA documents to be very technical. I think they're kind of still written like it's a tech report or master plan, where it's very detail orientated and the terminology is way above the general public's understanding. And so please be aware of that. Define any acronyms, terminology, or concepts that you're using. Please use graphics, any call out boxes that you can, photos and illustrations that help explain the technical terms better, and use subject matter experts as part of the interdisciplinary team. Remember, the Council on Environmental Quality's implementing procedures speak to interdisciplinary team. That means a number of people that collaborate on a NEPA document. It does not mean putting a tech in a cubicle and writing an environmental document without any background or knowledge or training to understand even what NEPA is, and CEQ and 1050 and 5050 and all of those special purpose laws and all of the intricacies associated with that. You need a number of people that needs to be involved in this. Documents must be clear, concise, supported, defensible, and fully coordinated. Please review the document internally for grammar, clear writing, compliance with NEPA before even sending it to the FAA. And again, the team is important. It's critical to the success of that project. Develop a comprehensive schedule, milestones, and deadlines, especially now with the dashboard that Josh and I are working under that he spoke of earlier. Open communication and trust is critical. Be active in your project, meet regularly, and communicate often. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sherry. Now, does anyone have any questions for her? If not, we will segue into Lindsay.
Good morning, everyone. I am switching gears directly to talk about FAA grants and funds. Some of this might be a little bit of review for some of the people after looking through the 3 pages of participants, which I'm really excited to have all of those people on our webinar. Stay with me here. Grants potentially can be a little dry, so I'm going to try and give you the best I can. So as we move along, obviously feel free to enter in something in the chat if you have questions. This is my birthday present to you all, grants and FAA funding. So we're going to talk about, let's see here, sorry. There we go. Rules and regulations, I won't get too far deep into that. Just the difference between appropriation and authorization. Everybody's favorite topic, money, money, money. Our capital planning process, and then the grant process life cycle. So how do we untangle all of these policy mysteries and rules and regulations? We have plenty for sure. We just need to make sure that we understand what they mean, what is the order of importance, and how we can move forward to be the best partner for aviation in general. So what are all these crazy rules? What are the differences between orders, regulations, guidance, advisory circulars, executive orders, and statutes? It seems like a whole bunch of legal jargon and policy things. It really does all make sense, and it really is a pyramid and a foundation for which the legislation house is built. Where does FAA get its money? Do we have just a magical money tree? I wish I did this year for sure, given all the house projects now that being home, you recognize that you need to do. What is the National Plan of Integrated Airport System? That's a big fancy word. We throw around the acronym a lot, the NIPIS. What's the AIP handbook? Why is it so important? And actually, if I follow all these rules, how do I actually get a project or a grant at my airport? So things that you need to remember is the order of preference. Things that your mom taught you, very important. Now that my son is 13 months old and starting to walk, he is testing the boundaries. So always remember things your mom taught you. Number 2, statute. That's where our reauthorization, that's the laws. That's the main focus of how FAA becomes the FAA. We have executive orders that Josh and Sherry talked about from the environmental side, but there are many other executive orders that each administration puts into enactment and policy, whatever the president at the time and the administration at the time feels is necessary. Regulations. We often talk about 2 CFR 200, which was enacted in 2015 and promulgated in 2016. And that governs all of how the federal government issues grants and other policies. It's general permanent rules that talk about how we can issue federal dollars to other entities. The orders, like AIP handbook, that is one that it's not a guide, it is an actual legal order that is signed and promulgated. Generally, our orders are used in-house, kind of telling FAA employees how to do things better, how to do our jobs and our work and run our programs. The AIP handbook is made publicly available, and it is in lieu of a regulation, and it is done so that you all 3,300 plus federally obligated airports have more of a guideline that has the same order as regulation. And then we have guidance. We've been streamlining some of our guidance lately into the reauthorization program guidance letters, which is what the R-PGL stands for. That was guidance that is easier to put out during a reauthorization, or things that go faster through, that doesn't have to go through as much legal review and promulgation through Congress and through other things. You all are familiar with advisory circulars and our standard operating procedures. We have many of them now. We've been working a lot on making sure that our standard operating procedures really are helpful for sponsors and consultants for things that we do in the field. So what's the difference between an authorization and an appropriation? 2 of these pieces of legislation the FAA needs. One is how we are an agency. It's kind of the permission to be who we are. It authorizes us to collect money. It authorizes us to have authorities. It authorizes us to spend the money when we get it. This is generally a multi-year bill. This last reauthorization was issued in 2018, and it is a 5-year bill. So it will expire September 30th of 2023. Our appropriation, so we have authorization as permission, appropriation is money. This is generally an annual bill. It allows the money to be used that is collected under the authorization. So it sometimes can have additional money. It sometimes has special allocations or different funding rules of how we spend the money. So this is a slide that I'm sure some of you have seen before. This is our legislative history. It's a lot of dots and a lot of colors, but it demonstrates that our federal fiscal year that starts October 1st of the fiscal year and runs through September 30th does not happen on October 1st, and we don't get our money on October 1st. You can see, looking back in the program fully funded graphic at the purple, we have in the last 13 years never had a budget in October. And only 1 year have we had a budget in November, which was 2006. And only 1 year previous have we had a budget in December. So when we talk about getting money early, I would love to have money in any one of those months other than some of the months that we get them. Now, you can also see that I did not put 2020 on here. That is intentional. The rest of the presentation will also not talk about 2020. Not that we're all trying to forget it, but it was a unique year with additional funding that we haven't quite figured out how to document in comparison to other years. So for the purposes of this presentation, I will be focusing on 2019, which was a little bit more of a normal year in all aspects. Here's just some of the information regarding our authorization and our appropriation. We are currently operating under the authorization, which I talked about, that was enacted in 2018, that provided for us to be authorized up to $3.35 billion. That number is important because in legislation, if we dip below that 3.35 billion, we cannot run the non-primary entitlement calculation, which means that magical $150,000 that each non-primary entitlement airport receives each year would not happen if we were not authorized to collect up to that point. Our appropriation, we were under a continuing resolution, as the rest of the government is, through December 11th. That expired. The House passed a 1-week extension, which expires tomorrow. We are hopeful that extension or an actual bill comes to fruition. I haven't checked today if we have something new, but I would assume that we will hopefully have either another extension or a full bill. One note of importance is from the Continuing Resolution Act that allowed us to be what we are, transferred $14 billion from the Treasury to the trust fund. That is not, that is very unprecedented because of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 acts and issues. The trust fund has become depleted. And there was a moratorium for airlines to not pay into the trust fund. In order for the trust fund to remain solvency, the Treasury Department transferred $14 billion to the trust fund. So where does all this money come from in normal land when we're all flying around and doing the things that we need to do? As you can see on the graphic, most of the money that you pay when you fly is your airfare. There are other things that pay for the services that go to pay for AIP grants and the services that the TSA provides. All of those things are what builds up the trust fund. And then in turn, we can turn around and give money to airports through our AIP grant program. When we talk about that $3.35 billion money, you go, ooh, that sounds like a whole heck of a lot of money. Unfortunately, when you get down to the brass tacks of all of $3.35 billion, which I wish my checking account had just once, you get to a point that you go, oh, when we start to slice and dice that money, gets real small real fast. It's broken into 3 categories: entitlement, discretionary, which everybody wants, and other formula funds. Our other formula funds are ones that we won't focus too much on. It's mostly our admin expenses, money that we contribute to the Airport Cooperative Research Program, ACRP, money that we fund for the Tech Research Center, and the Small Airport Community Air Service Fund. The 2 major funds that we focus on are entitlements and discretionary. So at the start of the year, we run a calculation off of that $3.35 billion, and it comes out to the bottom numbers in green. If you can look, the bottom of the start of 2019, we started with all of those entitlement funds at $2.394 billion and only $209 million in discretionary. So when we talk about competitiveness for discretionary funds, you can see that right at the beginning of the year, everybody is really fighting over pennies. When you look at, it's only $209 million to start the year. Said in a different way, we'll focus on the entitlements. That is the money that you all are pretty familiar with. It comes from primary airports. If you have cargo, your cargo entitlement airport, state apportionment, that is money that is allocated to the states based on a federal formula that we use from a federal standpoint to help fund other projects within the state. Then we have non-primary entitlements, probably the ones that you guys are most familiar with, your $150,000 a year. The small airport fund is not a separate set aside. It is really just money that is allocated to a minimum of money that has to be spent at small hub, non-hub, and general aviation and reliever airports. And then we have the Alaska set aside, supplemental. The most important portion of entitlements are the entitlements carried over from the previous year. And I'll explain that in further slides. But that is where we are pushing everybody to carry over your funds, and then we protect it for the following year. So when we start off, this is in graphical representation, you can see that the primary entitlements of that $2.39 billion represents 38%. But the past year carryover is 30%. And the non-primary entitlements is 17%. So all of that represents a lot of money that we have pretty much a good plan for when we are looking at spending and making sure that you guys are spending your entitlement dollars. So then we get into the very fancy, snazzy money that everybody wants. At the beginning of the year, when we started federal fiscal year FY19, $209 million is peanuts compared to the $2 billion we have in entitlements. So why is everybody so excited about discretionary? Because they don't generally have enough $150,000 to move forward with a project. So how do we get that $209 million to increase so that we can spend money on other projects? As you can see, most of the discretionary has noise or has set asides, noise, relievers, and military airport program. Then we have capacity, safety, and security noise projects and other pure discretionary. That pure discretionary is set by legislative floor, but not by ceiling, and it is generally very small. So at total funds at the beginning of the year, you can see that we start with 72% of our total $3.35 billion is entitlements, and only 6% is discretionary. And then the small airport fund, as I said, was not necessarily a set aside. It is an allocation that we have to spend a certain dollar amount on small airport funds. You'll see in some of your grants, it says this grant may contain small airport funds. That's what that is. So at the beginning of the year, we're like, whew, all we have is entitlements to spend, and we're chasing after this last little 6%. How do we fix that? Each year, we ask you to do your carryover. Now, I harp, my program managers harp, Andy Peak, our manager, harps. Everybody is carryover, carryover, carryover. If you know your community is not doing a project in federal fiscal year 2021, you need to have already communicated that to your program manager so that we can stop the slow burn of carryover by month. If you look, we don't get a full amount of carryover until these later months of the year. We get very little in the very beginning of the calendar year, fiscal year, and then it jumps very significantly later in the year. If we're still doing carryover in August and September, none of that money can be put under grant in a time that you can actually work on a project. So the carryover, entitlement carryover, gets converted into filling up the bucket of discretionary. So it gets magically unicorn sprinkles turned into from entitlement to discretionary. And then at the end of the federal fiscal year, the pie chart looks more like this. We have carried over money in order to balance entitlements to discretionary. So when you look at how can we change that 6% of discretionary at the very beginning of the year into this 44%, and how can I do it faster? It's a communication thing. You need to send your program managers an email that say, hey, I am not going to be doing my project this year. Please carry over my money. And as soon as you do that, you're basically helping out another airport that is seeking discretionary, because your carryover money gets converted into discretionary. So that helps us put another project moving faster. So after all that, how do I actually get a grant? I've decided I'm going to not carry over my money. I'm not going to transfer my money. I want a grant. So we need to be, your airport needs to be in the following things. In the National Program of Integrated Airport System, the NIPIAS. This is public information. This is the report to Congress. This basically says, I, community X, Y, and Z, have an airport and I am part of the public use system. It is in the report and everybody says, wonderful, you are then eligible for AIP, Airport Improvement Program. Then, once you are in the National Program of Integrated Airport Systems, you need to develop an ACIP, both a CIP and an ACIP. The ACIP is what we use internally to develop the 3-year plan. In the state of Minnesota, I think you guys are focused on a short-term and long-term plan. Minnesota asks for a 20-year plan for their planning purposes. The FAA uses that information to develop our ACIP so that we can identify funding needs and priorities for the next 3 years. We balance all of that with planning ceilings and estimates of what we can fund so that we have a pretty good idea of what we have to spend in this year, next year, and the following year. So then we meet with you all and talk about your CIP. And that is how we're going to spend your AIP money in the next few years. We focus on the AIP for this current fiscal year, and that list or group of lists is internal to the FAA until it is released by the Office of Secretary of Transportation, usually in some big splashy announcement. The Secretary, current administration really likes to do billion-dollar announcements as her splashy announcements for usually on a Friday. So our NIPIAS report was currently published in 2019. The NIPIAS order replaces previous orders, a CIP plan and a field formulation plan. It can be found at the link provided, and this allows for Congress to look at what are the needs out there in an airport. And so they are very dialed into how much airports need, what the capital planning requirements are, and what we need for future for the development at airports. ACIP, this is where we are looking at, eligible to be funded, whether or not it's justified, if it has reasonable development for the airport. A small general aviation airport shouldn't put forth a multi-million-dollar terminal renovation if the local community can't support it. So we look at all of those, and we have good conversations with each of our communities to make sure that the plan they put into place is actually something that they can implement. We want to set everybody up for success. So is the project eligible and justified? Most of that is defined in the AIP handbook. There are many pages and tables that go through eligibility and justification within the AIP handbook. That is a whole different class we could teach on eligible and justified projects. So as I mentioned, the AIP handbook is an FAA order. It is required to be followed by the FAA employees, myself, and all of our program managers. We must follow the AIP handbook. The AIP handbook, one thing that I think is a little misunderstood is permissive. So if it says you can, you can. If it doesn't say anything, it means you cannot. So getting to the basic steps in a grant process, we have multiple steps. A lot of this happens kind of behind the scenes, except for when myself or program managers are hounding you about getting information or asking for things. We have a lot of pre-grant actions, which is where we are right now in federal fiscal year 21, talking about getting things ready, preparing for our program. Fingers crossed that we get an appropriation soon so that we can actually move to the next step, which is grant programming, and then grant applications and offers, acceptance, our oversight, grant payments, and grant closeout. All of these steps are more further defined in Chapter 5 of the AIP handbook. It is about 80 pages. I am certainly not going to read it to you in the next 4 minutes because that would be dull and not important, but you can all read it for yourself. As you know, pre-grant actions, we've had CIP meetings. Most of you we do a risk assessment checklist that is due every 3 years. Josh touched on planning complete. This is very important. We are focused before we move into any environmental review to work with our planners within our offices and get your planning complete. Make sure it is on the ALP and your ALP is approved. Environmental review documents, both Sherry and Josh did an amazing job talking about those environmental reviews. Making sure that your consultant selection is up to date. If you participated last week, Andy touched on the consultant selection standard operating procedure. And the consultant selection advisory circular is very helpful. If you have any questions or you need us to review a request for proposals, please let us know. We are always able to help you walk through that process. Making sure your airspace is done in a timely manner. This generally has been taking 30 to 60 days. Given some of the backlog because of COVID-19, I would strongly suggest getting your airspace into the system soon, if not by January, very, very soon. Making sure that you have your plans and specs and or your engineer's design reports, your construction safety phasing plan, and then a pre-application or application, your standard form 424. In Minnesota, those are prepared by MnDOT as a channeling X state. So grant programming, reviews, and approvals. This is a lot of time that we spend internally entering things into our system, pushing buttons, moving it through the sausage making process. A lot of this does not, you don't see a lot of this. But you often ask, where's my grant? When am I supposed to expect a grant? How soon till I get my grant? It's a lot of waiting from all of us, your side and our side. And there are certain times and things that we can and can't talk about. The Office of Secretary of Transportation announcement is such. That is very important and not anything that we can supersede. The 3-day congressional notification period is set by legislation. I cannot tell you things until the 3-day congressional notification period has happened. It's not because I'm being secretive. I'm not Oz behind a curtain. It is by law something that has to happen. Congress has the authority to be notified in order for announcements to happen. So once all of that happens, then we get to write a grant. And that's really the great time. My favorite time of year is when we actually put all of that hard work and all of the planning and environmental and pre-grant stuff into action. We ask for the application for federal assistance. We ask for either the 5100 or the 5101. And all of the other documentation that goes along with the legal authority for us as the federal government to issue a grant. We sometimes ask you for other things, and that's just our way of making sure that the federal dollar that we are spending is done in a legal and a good manner to keep us all out of trouble. So when we issue you the grant, it comes with a whole stack of papers. Now this used to be, we used to kill multiple trees, boxes and boxes of paper. We would put in the printer and pray that our printer didn't go kaputs on us. These used to be 3 versions of pieces of paper: a grant letter, the grant agreement, which was about 40 pages, the applicable special conditions, the grant assurances, which is generally about 30 pages, all of our current advisory circulars, and then any number of the sponsor certifications. That all includes your grant package and your sponsor certifications. This year, in 2020, we were able to do all of that electronically. We sent out your grants through the DocuSign e-sign system. It is very secure. When we set up a grant to be signed out, it only goes to the people that is on that email, and it is processed. It only goes to the first person and then the second person and the third person. You cannot leapfrog and you cannot skip or delete someone in the process. So if you have a change in your personnel at your community for your FY21 grant and you need to be changed or added or somebody new, please let your program manager know so that we can make sure that when we start issuing grants, we have the proper email address so that we can put them in the system accurately. So all AIP grant payments go through our Delphi e-invoicing system. Luckily, in the state of Minnesota and South Dakota, in our ADO, we have 2 Channeling Act states. As an airport, you submit your payment request to the state and they do it on your behalf into Delphi. North Dakota submits their payments directly to Delphi. So this is when Minnesota requests payments, we review and approve, and then it goes through the Delphi system. It is a great way to get money and payments moving through the system. There are 2 policies written about it. If you really need something to do at night, feel free to read the AIP grant payment and sponsor financial reporting policy and the notice of new requirements and procedures for grant payment submission. I think that would be helpful if you are a newer sponsor or a newer city administrator looking to see what is necessary for grant payments. So the life cycle of a grant, and I'm trying to go quick, Catherine, I'm sure you're tapping the clock. The life cycle of a grant, most importantly, staying off the FAA's naughty list. This is really good fiscal management, spending the money we give you. Every year, every 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, reports are generated with balances. Who has spent their money? It is really difficult for Congress to give us more money when there is still money sitting out there unused. I cannot emphasize this enough. When we get reports that we have money under grant from 2019 that still hasn't been touched, it's really challenging for us to look in the mirror and say, yes, please give us more money. Everybody needs money right now. Everybody needs infrastructure and how we can continue to move aviation forward into the 21st century. So it's very important to spend down your grant. Make sure you're doing your first drawdown. If you received discretionary funds in your grant, by law, you have to do a drawdown within 6 months of receiving that grant. Make sure you're doing regular drawdowns. Don't just do it at closeout. Make the money work for you. Put the money into, reimburse yourself. This is money that your community, your airport has already spent. Fill back up your financial coffers. Stay off our list. I would love to pull my monthly list and have it be blank. I would love to not have to report on projects that haven't had a drawdown in the last 12 months or projects that have never had a drawdown. That is really important. Quarterly reports, make sure you are sending them to your program manager so that we can keep those in the file. Those are for audit purposes and for maintaining your obligations under 2 CFR 200. That's not an FAA requirement. That is a federal government, you getting money requirement. Lastly, reaching 10%. So in AIP, you're able to draw down your grant to 10%. Unfortunately, a lot of airports do that, reach the 10% and then let the grant sit. That last 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but when you do it and your friends at your other airports do it, those 10% sitting around add up, and it becomes another way that we're not being fiscally responsible for grants. Lastly, the grant closeout process. This is incredibly important. Andy touched on it last week, we have a standard operating procedure that has been put in effective since 2017. We don't just do this because I love grant closeouts. We don't just harp on this because it's a good idea. We do this because if there is money left over in the grant, we can put that back into our coffers. We can make it work for us. If you use your money and you close it out before that money expires, you can use it again. We can put it on a new grant. If the money has expired, it comes back to us and we can recycle it. It might not necessarily go back to you, but we use it for amendments. We use it for other things that we can recoup those funds in order to put the money back to work. So don't sit on your projects as closeouts. Don't sit on that last 10%. Put that money to work. The sooner you close it out, the potential to recoup any additional funds that's sitting around there, we can put back into the aviation community. Very, very important. And that concludes, I went 8 minutes over. I did as quick as I could. I am not from the East Coast. I'm just from Chicago, and we do our best to talk fast.
No, you did great. This is very important information. So thank you, Lindsay, Sherry, and Josh. Do we have any last minute questions for them? Looking around. Okay, well, if there are no questions, you know how to reach them. And again, this is being recorded, and I'll be sending a follow-up email probably later this afternoon, and it will include the link to this. So if you want to share it with anyone that was unable to attend, go ahead and do that, okay? So again, thank you so much to Lindsay, Sherry, and Josh. And I see Andy was on today for last week with Carl and Martin. So again, thank you so much to the FAA, and thank you for everyone taking time out of their day today. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of the presenters today. And have a wonderful week, and Happy New Year and Christmas. So bye, everyone.